Kia ora. It's great to be here, and it's so exciting to see you've all stayed to after lunch, so thank you for that. Look, I've got the real privilege of introducing our next speaker. So Dr. David Codyre is a psychiatrist extraordinaire, and I've had the real privilege of knowing him for probably 15 years or so, since we're working at ProCare together. And he's just done a huge amount across a whole range of domains. He's been working in community and hospital for 30 years in a range of leadership positions, and has spent the last 17 years developing primary mental health programs and advocating both at the regional and the national level to strengthen primary mental health, because it's an area that's really struggled to get a lot of focus in the past, and really does bring that integration into secondary services. Takes a really holistic approach, and has been really integrates the psychiatry, the psychological, therapeutic and integrative approaches, and he's currently working at Tamaki Health with a network of 40 clinics, and he'll talk a little bit about the latest work that he's been involved with a whole lot of other groups to develop the Te Tumu Waiora program, which he's going to talk about. And the other amazing and wonderful news to be able to share with you is that in January he was awarded a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit. So David, congratulations, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Janine, and thanks to you and your team for what actually has been an amazing forum. I wish I'd actually managed to get here for yesterday, because certainly this morning's been fantastic. Look, it's funny, isn't it, how wherever you are in the health system, you tend to get a very kind of siloed view of it. And part of this work that I'm about to talk to you about, I've kind of framed as being developing a primary care system fit for future, fit for purpose in the 21st century. But listening to Mia today made me realise that really we face the reality that we have a whole health system that is no longer fit for purpose. So, you know, our systems evolved in an era where most health need was acute. That's no longer the case, but somehow we haven't managed to evolve health systems in ways that have kept up with the way that health need has changed. So look, I mean, I guess to start with, just to acknowledge that this work that's come together in the model that has at least had the name Te Tumu Waiora was a collaboration between an enormous number of parties, DHBs, PHOs, NGOs, more recently iwi, Pacific providers and so on. So it's been the various strands of it that have come together have really been an incredible experience, probably unmatched in my 30-odd years in the health sector and my experience before, to actually have people collaborating together so well. So what were the issues that we were trying to solve? I mean, a lot of it's been covered today already, but I mean, the reality is that in people attending general practice, mental health need, distress is very, very common. 1 in 3 people with a diagnosable condition, let alone people just with broader distress. We know that unlike the notion that I grew up with when I was a med student and psychiatric registrar, which was that there was serious mental illness and the rest was trivialised as the worried well, and we know that that's far from the reality now. And I mean, one little vision of that is that 40% of people on a sickness benefit for more than 2 years in this country are there by virtue of what the GP is saying is a mental health reason. But also, of course, having a long-term condition greatly increases the chances of having struggles with your well-being, and that's for complex reasons, part of which were alluded to earlier on today about just the struggles of adjusting to having a long-term condition, the grief and loss that one has to deal with, let alone the struggles of how to navigate an impossibly complex health and social services system. But also there's increasingly recognition that there are also underpinning common factors driving both poor mental health and poor physical health. And then beyond that is this kind of complex strain of medically unexplained symptoms, so chronic pain and so on, which are distressing for people and for which we as health providers have actually had very little that is useful for people around how to manage with those. And particularly from a medical perspective, we still live in this mind-body split situation, which I think creates an impossible situation for both the clinicians, let alone the people living with these issues. And from a doctor perspective particularly, I mean, this is the reality. I mean, you're always worried about missing that kind of, rare but potentially devastating condition. So that's the reality that my GP colleagues, and I mean, I say, as a specialist working in primary care, my job is easy, actually, because by the time people get to me, the hard work's been done. It's actually the GPs, nurses, and other members of the team who really have the hard work. So, I mean, this is the reality. GPs, nurses have very little time, and as we heard earlier on today, also we have an ageing workforce, so the reality is we're going to have to figure out ways of working with fewer GPs. The model of care was designed at a time when acute issues were the main thing, whereas the preponderance now is American term, but I think at least in talking with health providers, not necessarily with the community, but the notion of behavioural health I think is a useful one because it covers the whole health behaviour terrain from mental health through long-term conditions. Medical practice has become enormously more complex. GPs and nurses are time poor, and actually their training doesn't equip them necessarily to deal well with behavioural health skills. Most absorb it by osmosis and are actually very good at it, but it's not by virtue of what they've been trained to do. So look, I mean, I came into primary mental health in the early 2000s, and at that stage our focus was depression, anxiety, addiction, and so now around the country most PHO and general practice services have some level of primary mental health response based on a very small amount of funding. And it's interesting, the ministry at the time put out money, said try some stuff, different people tried different stuff, but they all came up with some core things: training and supporting GPs and practice nurses, funding extended consultations in primary care, and also funding and referral systems for access to packages of talking therapy, most often and sometimes also other psychosocial support. And the interesting thing is they all worked. So the external evaluation showed that about 80% of people benefited, and it actually didn't matter what you accessed. Generally, you got something out of it. So that was all very good at the time, and in fact, the GPs and their teams loved having that kind of support there. People who accessed it appreciated the help they got, and with the tiny amount of resource, actually, the feeling was that it had been done reasonably well with. But the reality is that we'd kind of really stood on the firm ground of what, as people who'd come largely from various mental health contexts, that we knew. But it still left our colleagues facing, what do I do when I have someone who's acutely distressed in front of me, and I can refer them, but they're not going to be seen for 2, 3, 4 weeks. What about people who need help but who won't attend referred services for a variety of reasons? What about the social issues and stress and difficulties navigating social services and so on and so on and so on? So really, more recently, the focus has been recognising that primary care mental health still faces fundamental problems. So firstly is the reality that antidepressant prescribing decade by decade is going up and up and up and up. Now, some people would say that's a good thing, but actually the evidence tells us very clearly that the only place for antidepressants is with the most severe, persistent depression. But the problem is, though, if you're a GP faced with someone who's distressed and you refer them, but you know it's going to be a number of weeks before they can be seen, it's hard to do nothing except, say, come back in a week or two. The other thing is that the suicide rate, despite everything we've done in this country, has remained stubbornly static. So clearly what we're doing, if that is the kind of indication of worst possible outcome when people are struggling with their mental health and well-being, we're not making an impact. And this was more challenging for me in my context. We work in high-needs communities, and our rates of actually displaying a lot of effort and a lot of designing solutions with people around how to do better, we still could not get people who needed our support in to see us. I mean, basically, out of 100 people referred, we managed to schedule an appointment with half and to see a third. So basically 2/3 of the people we weren't seeing, and when we talked to the GPs and nurses, invariably it was the people they were most worried about who we weren't seeing. So that told us that, again, that was a fundamental quality issue with the model. And then more broadly, there's this whole increasing awareness about increasing prevalence of diabetes, and so this is just a bit of a summary of what the problems were that really led us to say we've got to fundamentally come up with some different ways of doing this. So, the whole issue around mental health need, presenting in primary care, the wider behavioural health issues, terrain. Again, it was really interesting that in terms of that referral to scene data, around the same time we came up with that, both Australia and the UK, having poured huge amounts of money into referral-based access to talking therapies, saw no impact on population wellbeing. And their experience mirrored ours, that despite everything, only about a third of people who would benefit were actually being seen. The other problem, of course, though, is that if we're talking about packages of care, one full-time therapist can see around 225 people in a year. So if we think about conservatively 10% of the population would benefit from some level of psychological and or social support, that equates for your average GP to about 0.75 of a practitioner for every GP. We just don't have the workforce to do that. So fundamentally that model was never going to get us anywhere anyway. So this whole new ways of meeting wider needs has been a journey over the last 7 years. And it's really first and foremost been about testing 3 new roles. And this was all tested very separately, so it wasn't like there was any intention to end up where we have. But the first of these, beginning in 2013-14, came out of a co-design process with the Tamaki community in Auckland, between ADHB, ProCare, other PHOs, including my own, and a bunch of mental health NGOs. And one of the perceived needs of that community was unmet mental health, social, cultural needs. So one of the outcomes of that was this enormous collaboration of what ultimately was 2 DHBs, a number of PHOs, a number of NGOs, providing basic walk-beside support for people delivered by peer and community support workers. And these are the principles that came out of the co-design process. I mean, they're very much about being in the community, being with people, mirroring in your provision the culture of the community, giving people choices, recognising that if I'm struggling now, it's a point in my life and that can change, and so on. It really hinged, and it was a very evolutionary process, but over time we came to see it as hinging off 3 key sets of relationships. Firstly, between the GP team and a lead NGO for who they, and for bigger clinics it's more than one. So, for example, in our pilot clinic it was a community support NGO and also a peer support NGO, so there was some choice there. The second and key thing, though, was the lead NGO, other NGOs. So if we warm-handed off to them, let's say someone who was Māori, but neither of them were kaupapa Māori NGOs, part of their role was to pathway the person to what was going to be the most appropriate NGO support for them. And then most critically was the person-support worker relationship which developed. So this is a bit of a snapshot of the range of kinds of issues that were the primary need that people identified themselves as having. So a real mix of emotional, mental well-being, physical health, and broader social needs. I mean, this is one of many, many stories that came out of those early days, but I think anyone who works in a primary care setting would recognise that this is a not uncommon scenario of someone rocking up to primary care, but where historically your capacity sitting in a general practice setting to really do anything right now about that has been so limited. So, I mean, it's just one of many examples of the ways that practical support is actually having a huge impact in people's lives and empowering them really to get on with their lives. So that's a little snapshot about the first bit of this. The second role is that of a health coach. This is another bit that I was much more centrally involved in. Awhiora, we were kind of involved, but less centrally. So, I mean, and this in my context came from the reality that we came in to provide primary mental health services, but actually recognised that you cannot talk about mental health and long-term conditions separately. So, you know, whichever way you look at it, I mean, if you've got a long-term condition, you're much more likely to have mental health need and have it actually be quite significant, and vice versa, that people with severe mental health and addiction conditions have a much higher rate of poorly managed long-term conditions and tend to die much younger than the rest of us. So, and that has impact for the health system as well. I mean, it hugely impacts on medical, surgical utilisation. And then you add psychosocial cultural need to that, and it further adds to poor outcomes and complexity. And basically, as an existing primary mental health programs, we'd failed to address that based on what we were doing. So we went on a bit of a journey, really, which started with beginning with Janine and others at Procare in those days, this whole notion of what was then called the Stamford Chronic Disease Self-Management Program, we now call the Manage Better Program, but it's a peer-led, manualised self-management program, which we saw as actually, on the one hand, needing investment, but on the other hand, actually seeing quite transformational outcomes for people in terms of just taking charge of their well-being and their lives. Went on a bit of a journey that also took us down the road of health coaching more formally, and developed this kind of wheel of self-management support options based on some work that came out of California around peer support programs for people with long-term conditions. So this is the basic 5 roles of a health coach, but hopefully most of you are familiar with that. Really, while health coaching can be anyone, what we had found was that the engagement and support that came from having a peer and or cultural health coach workforce has been the thing that has really delivered hugely in the context that I work, which is high needs, multicultural populations and clinics through Metro Auckland. And one of the key things in health coaching is supported appointment. So when the person goes in to have an appointment around their long-term condition, having some preparation around what your agenda is and empowering people to have that agenda be key to the consultation. The notion actually that we treat people as VIPs, even as something as simple as that, asking permission about things, basically screening for mental health need, going from what doctors and nurses are told, which is tell, to, we've had other people describe it as ABC, in our context it's ask, tell, ask. The notion of knowing your numbers, it's actually just been stunning how many people who actually work in the health sector have their own health issues and actually have not had the help to understand, for example, what HbA1c means. So closing the loop, which is around after the consultation, connecting what the outcomes were to the person's understanding of what they are going to do, translating it into an action plan, which is very individually tailored. Focus on medication counselling, and working between the GP team, the pharmacy and the person, just to reconcile the whole picture. And there's a photo that came in some early work with counties of a table, which was a pyramid of blister packs and packs of medicines and so on that had come from one person's house. It's kind of scary the way that that can all pan out. And also using information effectively. So look, this slide is just really to capture what got us on the whole peer cultural engagement track, which is that in the early days of working around supporting people who were frequently attending Middlemore Hospital ED or admitted with long-term conditions, but who also were not engaging well in planned healthcare activity. Most of it was unplanned via ED. And so we were trying to engage that group of people in a self-management support-focused way to help them do better. And it was a really interesting process. And as reflected in what others have said, but when we talked to the providers, the basic notion was no matter what we do, these people don't want to be well. That's what it kind of came down to. But when you talk to the person, you've got a very different story, as has been manifestly apparent in the other presentations I've seen today about the realities of life and of what it's like and trying to engage with this crazy health system we've somehow ended up with. So we trialled the whole peer cultural engagement, and our engagement rates basically just about doubled overnight, as you can see. And this is the initial cohort of people who were part of that bit of work and who basically have now, 5 years later, still sustained a 45% reduction in hospital contacts. I'll never forget this man, and he's given us permission for us to put his face up there, he and his partner, so Diva, his wife, and Merle, the first of our 2 peer specialists, we call them in those days. And it's just his story, but actually, the reason I will never forget this guy is that he had come, Merle had engaged him, he'd come along to a kaupapa Māori themed self-management program. So the Stamford program delivered from within a cultural context. Merle was running, and she grabbed me and said, David, I want you to come meet Diva, because I was booked to see him in 3 weeks. And the reason I was booked to see him as the psychiatrist was because everyone was so worried about him, and his PHQ-9 score was hugely high and had been for a long time. He'd been prescribed meds, they clearly weren't working. It had been challenging to engagement and everything else. And what I met was a man who looked like he was in his late 70s, stooped over, looking dreadful, wearing a swan-dry top, pyjama bottoms and slippers. And so I met him and was going to see him 3 weeks later, and he turned up 3 weeks later, and it took me 5 minutes to realise it was the same guy. Because he was no longer stooped, he was standing up, he looked like he'd regained some mana. All that had happened is he'd been to 3 of those programs. The first one he came with his wife, the second one he brought his whole whānau, the third one the same. He didn't need me anymore. So, it's an anecdote, but actually it was just an example of the change we saw. And so I came to see that I'd started off saying, well, if we provide talking therapies, we won't need meds. Well, actually even more if you provide this basic kind of engagement, support, hope, and equipping people with the tools to manage, then actually you need less of the high intensity stuff. So then the next stage was health coaching in GP clinics, and this was the first 6 months working in a team that had all been trained up with that peer cultural engagement and health coaching component, and what was seen as reasonably significant improvements in HbA1c. So in the third bit of this, and this was the bit that ProCare led and that we kind of came in on the tail of, was developing this whole primary care behavioural health consultant role, which in New Zealand is called a health improvement, has come to be called a HIP or health improvement practitioner. Not sure I like the language, but that's fine. So really this is about having, in a primary care setting, an available therapist, basically, a mental health worker. So they're generalists, see anyone. It's accessible, it's available on the same day or at the very most the next day. It's team-based care, so it's not about a therapist working in isolation from the rest of the team. High productivity, so working in this one-off intervention with an open door to come back, think back to 225 people can access a package of care in a year. In this model, 600 to 800 people, sometimes more, can access what I'll show later as a relatively effective intervention. There's a very strong role of educating, supporting, upskilling the rest of the primary care team, and also a routine care component, which is about the population level element of the role. So just as a kind of a little quick comparison, I mean, this is the more standard way that a therapist works, where they're separate from practice, referral-based, scheduled appointments, tend to see people for X number of sessions, as opposed to the role that we've developed in Auckland, which is very much seen as a consultant to the team. Primary consumer is actually the GP. You're working, supporting the GP and meeting the needs of people. Very team-based, on demand, and so on. So it is... it's been quite transformational, and this is to highlight the 2 levels of role. So there is the warm handover on the same day, brief sessions, 20 to 30 minutes. Whoever said that to work with someone effectively, you needed an hour, which is the traditional mantra of therapy? It's been really interesting that people get an awful lot out of 20 to 30 minutes. Based on a very problem-focused, solution-focused approach to helping people to figure out actions that will help address what's going on. It's based on the fundamental principle that most people struggling with mental health and well-being, and this is Bruce Arrell, GP colleague's words, but the best way to understand, and the thing people most identify with, is not that they're depressed or anxious, but that they're stuck. There's a problem in their lives that they're stuck with. And so FACT is very much around identifying where that problem sits and some solutions, or at least a plan about how you might go about trying something different to address it. And it's very much aiming for most consultations to be a one-off with an open door to return, rather than I'm going to see you 6 times in the next 2 months. Very much individual, couple, family, group, whatever works for people. But more importantly, there's the second population level, which is in partnership with health coaching, with health coaches, and it's very much identifying who are the groups of people within our practice population who are having issues that they need support with, which can be framed as much more a group approach. So it might be your number of people who are smoking, it might be people with chronic pain, whoever, was it Mia who said frequent flyers is actually fair enough, not a good language to use. So I guess I got a D, didn't I? poorly managed kind of diabetes or whatever. And tends to use recall contact lists as a very strong outreach engagement focus, hence the kind of peer cultural outreach, and tends to be one-to-one or actually group medical visits. So, if you've got a bunch of people with chronic pain, they tend to need to come back for scripts. Why not get them all in the same morning, run a group on that day, do some education, get all the scripts on the same day, and so on. So look, this was the bit that we hadn't tested in a New Zealand setting, but that we certainly had confidence from overseas that it actually delivered reasonable outcomes, and I have to say in very linguistically and culturally diverse settings as well. So it had evolved in an equivalent kind of population context in the United States, but at both an individual outcomes and also a system outcomes level was showing a lot of promise. So people were not only doing better, but actually they were needing secondary care less. There was actually a reduction in antidepressant prescribing, which we had as an explicit goal of this pilot as well. But more importantly, the satisfaction of both the people and the GPs was incredibly high, and GPs saw themselves as then being able to work more appropriately with people using their skill set. So Te Tumu Wairua was about bringing all of that together in a pilot over the period of 2017 to 2018, and this graphic is an attempt to really kind of illustrate it. So thinking about person whānau and a range of community things that they can access directly, but beyond that, having this whole access to NGO support, albeit out of a GP team, is very much sitting at that interface between the kind of clinical service provision and the community and the person's world, and dealing with very practical issues. And then an enhanced multidisciplinary general practice team, so GP, practice nurse, credentialed practice nurse, which other parts of the country have also had now for a while, this notion of credentialing practice nurses for mental health. But these two new roles, the health improvement practitioner, the warm handoff mental health clinician, and also the health coach, which we've certainly encouraged as being a peer cultural role. Beyond that, though, of course, beyond that, still having the existing primary mental health infrastructure, which does remain important. I mean, you can't do away with that, we've found. And beyond that, the interface with secondary services. And the two things that had been trialled as part of the other evolving things, which I talk about later, was primary care liaison roles out of mental health services and also telephone advice for GPs from a psychiatrist. So that was the kind of overall conceptualisation of this model that was being tested. So first of all, out of that, providing the walk alongside community-based awhiora support, which had been refined by this stage, so had always been free, was framed as very early intervention. Now, people talk about mild to moderate in primary mental health. It's actually an incredible euphemism, really, because our experience is that actually most people we see don't have mild needs. GPs and practice nurses are really good at dealing with mild mental health stuff. We were finding ourselves much more seeing people with complex mix of psychosocial issues and really moderate to severe mental health and or addiction need that had been enduring over quite a long time. But that one of the key things that have been a learning is that you can't take a support worker out of a secondary service context and have them be effective in a primary care setting. So there was a whole learning process that they had to go through, which actually, funnily enough, I was around when community support services started in Auckland, and what they framed it, the role as being, was actually what community support was always supposed to be. And I kind of realised that NGO community support has kind of got colonised by the psychiatric model, which is kind of tragic. But anyway, what they did do was reorient themselves to working in a way that was about non-clinical, depathologizing practical support for what's important to you in your life. And the key thing there, though, with all of this was actually developing relationships between a lead community or peer support worker from the NGO and the practice team, so that even though they weren't there, they were considered a virtual member of the team. And referral became a dirty word, so we kind of had a virtual $2 coin jar, and everyone who used the word R word had to put $2 in it. So it was just to try and reframe that we don't have referrals, we have handoffs between people who are part of the team. Then the second bit was then along at the same time testing, bringing together the health coach role, which had been tested and we had confidence in, and this new behavioural health consultant role into an enhanced multidisciplinary team. So that was initially in 7 practices. By now, Awhiora was present in probably about 30 practices in Auckland, but it was bringing in this more extended integrated team that was the key step. So in the States, BHCs are all doctorate psychologists. Actually, we've had a variety of people with a mental health background come into these roles, and they've all been successful as long as they get the support. And it is quite an intensive training and induction process into the roles. The second thing, though, is that there's really no criteria, and for anyone who's worked in a DHB setting, that is two things that were really hard to get your head around. Number one, there's no criteria. You see anyone. If they have the need, you see them. And number two, your role is to help the rest of the team. Okay? So that was a real reorientation for clinicians coming into these roles. And also the third thing was that you do not work independently. I mean, the GP always has the clinical responsibility. In a way, that's the only thing that allows that high productivity, more light touch role. I'm not going to read to you the quotes here, but they all come from the evaluation. So the notion of warm handover, delivered in the practice, brief sessions, also importantly writing in the shared record so that it keeps everyone on the same page. And then health coaching, similarly, but a non-registered workforce, working as part of an integrated team, we've kind of really had this notion of peer professional partnership, which is actually a journey, but when you get to a place where each truly values each other's role, it's an incredibly functional way of working. Similarly, though, warm handover, brief focused intervention, open door to come back, writing in a shared record. So that was what Te Tumu was, bringing all of that together. Just a little vignette. So again, it could be one of many. Now, hopefully this is big enough for you to read what's in the squares, because I'm not going to read. All I'm going to do is point out the basic trajectory of this is one of what could be one of many examples. The reason that we particularly use this one is that it shows handoff to a number of roles. And actually you might think that people being handed off to a number of different people might be a very user-unfriendly way of working, but actually we've time and time again found that people really value that. They don't feel that the handoff is an issue as long as it's a personal thing rather than a referral, and as long as they don't have to retell their story over and over again. So Charlotte, young mum with a range of struggles who comes to a GP. And it's clear that there are a range of issues which are less about the baby's wheezing and more about the rest of what's going on in her life. So she's very distressed, and so the GP has a mental health credentialed nurse who has some training and just being able to de-escalate that distress, listen, hear what the problem is, and figure out some initial steps with the person. So they do that and develop a bit of an action plan, which includes seeing the mental health practitioner, the health improvement practitioner who was in the practice on that day. So there's a warm handover there, and they spend a bit of time together and develop some techniques for her around managing her panic attacks, and end up with an action plan around that, which includes access to one community resource, which in this case is the telehealth service, as part of the plan for backup when she needs it. But also, given the clear outstanding issues around housing, the part of the agreed plan is the handoff for NGO support to address that. And so in the subsequent days, there was a meeting with the NGO support worker, and they get busy with sorting out the housing issue. So just a little example of the ways that all these roles can work together. So look, a ministry pilot, externally independently evaluated. This is just a very high-level summary of the outcomes. I mean, the things to me that were particularly pleasing in this was, given our data around our referral translation rates, more than 90% of people were actually seen in this model. Differentially, we saw increased access in 3 groups who'd been underrepresented. Well, you could argue that with Māori. Certainly Pacifica young adult, but I believe Māori as well have not had access to primary mental health in the established way. Well, in this, they did have much increased access by and large, except Pacifica only slightly. Good clinical outcomes. Interestingly, the greatest improvements in symptom scores in Māori. The thing that really warmed my heart was that in the one clinic where we were able to get this data in the evaluation phase, there was actually prescribing had been tracking down, just based on the work we'd been doing around reinforcing the notion that your therapeutic relationship is really important. People get a lot out of that. You tend to see people on the worst day in their lives. The evidence says that prescribing is only indicated when someone has severe persisting depression, anxiety. But sort of been trickling down, but it really plummeted over the 6 months of the pilot evaluation. But also, this was incredibly valued in terms of usefulness. So one of the things people did was rate on the day how useful was this service to you, and the ratings were generally 9+ out of 10. And also, based on that pilot phase, even when people were really getting into role, both HIPS health coaches, even at that stage, if you extrapolate it over 12 months, we're going to be seeing 500 to 600 unique people. And in fact, as the role matures, we are confident that it will get above that. So it's going to greatly increase access at a population level. Just very quickly, some of the data. So Awhiora Reach differentially did really well across Māori and Pacific. Health Coach Reach, again, differentially did really well across Māori and Pacifica. The HIP Reach, the challenge is around this space, so that's part of ongoing work around how we can actually increase access for Pacifica. In terms of outcomes, Awhiora used the K10, and overall there was a significant shift from entry to exit towards lower scores, greater well-being. The HIP and Health Coach use a more kind of holistic measure called the Duke Health Profile. So scores at entry really just reinforced that we were not working with them worried well. I mean, basically 50% of people, 40 to 50% of people were more than 2 standard deviations from the mean in terms of wellbeing scores. But reassuringly, what we saw, where are we? In terms of people who we could get follow-up data, and this, because a lot of it was, the average number of contacts was, the mode contacts was 1, the average was 2. So we had to follow up people actively to get them to re-complete the scoring. But basically, across overall, there was an improvement, and particularly the interesting thing, which was really surprising to us, was that the greatest shift in this more holistic wellbeing measure was seen in Māori who accessed the service. So look, beyond all of that, there have been 2 key enablers in this whole journey, and the first has been what in the recent RFP around what the Ministry have called increased access and choice of mental health and addiction support has been competent and capable GPs and nurses, and the second has been close working relationships with secondary care. So this bit of work came out of counties particularly, counties Manukau, around the whole upskilling of GPs and nurses. So they've been a active part of the regional practice nurse credentialing program now for quite a number of years, and have also worked on upskilling the general practice workforce as well, and shifting to empower GPs to do more in their own practice. This is really the overarching kind of intent of the model of care, where people feel heard, they know options, they have a team there to support them, and goals to work towards. And from a practice perspective, has been trying to make a model that's easy to use, more flexible, and with a wider team around them to support them. Again, evaluated by Synergia and found both from a person's subjective report perspective and also from a change in depression anxiety scores perspective to be effective. And this is based on an average, again, of 2 to 3 extended GP practice nurse consultations. Last bit of it is closely working with secondary care. I mean, in the early days of the pilot, what we struggled with was we saw a lot of people with quite alarming levels of suicidal ideation and or other quite severe mental health and issues and distress. But actually accessing secondary care was very challenging. So there's been a real process of really advancing on where things had got to, so that there's a psychiatrist phone line across the whole Metro Auckland now, so that a GP can get a psychiatrist on the phone. We have these primary care liaison roles, which have also been really enabling of the whole thing. And in counties, trialling a notion of what they call ILOC, integrated locality teams, which is a subset of their community mental health team providing consultation liaison support to GPs, and which is highly valued by the GP teams that access it. So, putting that all back into context then, I mean, historically, mental health programs nationally in primary care have had $20 million, and I frame that to my DHB colleagues as being that primary care has had 2% of the total mental health addiction spend to meet 75% of the moderate to severe need. The wellbeing budget has actually dedicated a big chunk of investment over 5 years into changing that. The intent is to develop 1,600 new primary care-based roles across the, I put BHC a mistake, it's what we in New Zealand are calling the HIP health coach NGO support, based in all GP clinics, providing access to the targeted 325 people a year who are not currently accessing any help. Of course, the biggest challenge is going to be where we're going to find that workforce. So, I think I'll finish there and finish with this. So Jacinda Ardern and David Clark came out and visited some of the pilot sites in Auckland, one in Mangere, one in Otara, and talked to people providing it, but also talked to people who'd used the service. We were kind of trying not to get too optimistic about getting some money just to extend on what had been smell of an oily rag pilots, but this is what came back. So, I mean, it's going to be an enormous challenge, but hopefully I've given you a bit of a flavour for the value that this can add. This work is not the only focus for that investment. There is, hopefully you're all aware, also is dedicated funding around kaupapa Māori, Pacific for Pacific, and youth solutions as well. Thank you. I've got some time in me.
Thank you, David. It was just fantastic.
Oh, pleasure.
Look, it's so exciting to see how far this has come. From times when I've phoned trying to get support for a patient who was suicidal, and I'll be told they're not acutely so suicidal at the moment, you can keep looking after them. So to see a program has now reached this level is really, really exciting as a GP. So David, thank you for championing this, for everyone who's been involved in this, from Alan Moffat and others all across the room. But look, this is really exciting, and we really want to see this continue. And I'm sure there's those in the room that want to be part of this. Yeah, and we really need to do our part.
As well, actually.
Yeah, there's.
Pen, it was really good hearing your experience, and Taupo Turangi, if you're still here.
Oh,
right.
Yeah. So the thing we can take away from this is what can we do to encourage colleagues or maybe even family members or people we know to get involved, to become part of that workforce, and to really focus on building the Māori and Pacific workforce to be part of this. So David, thank you so much. Yeah.